What up, everybody? This is Chapter 10 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. This chapter is Chapter 10, Stalin as a Philosopher. From the account just given of philosophical life in the Soviet Union, it will be clearly evident that throughout the whole of the Stalinist period, Stalin himself was the only person in the Soviet Union who could ever dare to say anything new. In his lifetime, therefore, his contributions to the progress of Marxist philosophy were hymned in the highest superlatives by the Soviet philosophers. His short pamphlet on dialectical and historical materialism, which is the title, was then reckoned as, quote, a creation, marking an epoch in the development of Marxist-Leninist philosophy and of world historical significance, end quote. M.B. Mitten. This makes it necessary for us to inquire whether Stalin did in fact contribute to the development of Marxist philosophy, and in what sense Stalin can be called an original thinker. It must certainly be said of the eulogies which Soviet authors bestowed during his lifetime on Stalin's services to philosophy that they are altogether too flattering to Stalin, but here one must also guard, on the other hand, against an oversimplified manner of approach, for owing to the principle of the unity of theory and practice, and also to that of partisanship, practice, i.e. concrete social and political life, becomes an essential factor in the process of gaining knowledge of truth. Truth is discovered on this view in the concrete conduct of life. The leader of the party is giving direction to the proletarian class in its practice, thereby necessarily contributes to theory as well. This will explain, for example, how on the occasion of Stalin's 70th birthday, the editors of the Philosophical Journey of Approach Philosophy were able to bring off the tour de force of packing virtually the whole of a 334-page number of the paper with articles on Stalin. For, quote, philosophy, in Soviet terminology, includes not only dialectical but also historical materialism. Hence we find that this issue contains, besides a number of properly philosophical articles, a variety of essays on social and political topics as well. Stalin's not very extensive literary output began as early as 1901 and consists for the most part of articles published in various newspapers. Particular importance attaches to a series of essays, Anarchism or Socialism of 1906/07, and a pamphlet dating from 1912/1913, Marxism and the National Question. A number of articles written in 1917 appeared in book form in 1925, together with an introduction, The October Revolution and the Tactics of the Russian Communists, under the title On the Road to October. In April 1924, Stalin delivered a series of lectures at the Sverdlov University in Moscow on the foundations of Leninism, which later formed the nucleus of the celebrated collection of his writings titled Problems of Leninism. Very wide circulation has also been given to Stalin's report titled On the Draft Constitution of the USSR, delivered on the 25th of November 1936 to the extraordinary Eighth Congress, which was summoned to ratify the new constitution. A peculiarly outstanding importance among Stalin's works was attributed in its day to the History of the Communist Party Soviet Union B short course, which from 1948 onwards was ascribed to Stalin himself, although Stalin's authorship of this work, published as, quote, edited by a commission of the Central Committee, is only to be understood in a somewhat indirect manner, meaning that Stalin himself may have laid down the main ideas and the, quote, interpretation to be put upon events. There seems little doubt, however, that he was actually the author in much more immediate fashion of what would certainly have been the most responsible and hazardous portion of the book for any of his subordinates to have undertaken, namely Section 2 of Chapter 4, titled On Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Of this short 27-page account, it is said, in what was then the ultra-official biography of Stalin, that it, quote, raises dialectical materialism to a new and higher level, end quote, is one of the pinnacles of Marxist-Leninist philosophical thought, end quote. Of Stalin's later works, his book, On the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, enjoyed a particularly large circulation. It is a collection of his reports, speeches, and orders during the period of World War II. A very fundamental importance for the subsequent development of Soviet philosophy attaches to his two last works, Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, published in 1950, which set the ideological tone during the closing years of the Stalinist era, and the book Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, published in 1952, which was written shortly before his death and continued to dominate the field until his second burial at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956. By decree of the Central Committee of the CPSUB, the publication of Stalin's collected works was put in hand from 1946 onwards. 16 volumes were planned, but only 13 of these have seen the light of day. The Russian edition was paralleled by editions in 15 other languages of the peoples of the Soviet Union, and Gradoboyev has described the desperate exertions required of the Commission of the Central Committee, entrusted under the presidency of Molotov, with the issue of these collected works. In order to fill up the volumes as ordained, they not only collected the articles Stalin had published in the various newspapers, but also tracked down all his letters and telegrams, the records of his telephone conversations, and every scrap of paper that had ever been written on, or at least signed by Stalin. When even this proved insufficient to make up the prescribed number of volumes, they found themselves compelled to credit Stalin with works that he had never written. Gradoboyev designates as such the dissertation titled The National Question and Leninism, contained in volume 11 of the collected works, which is alleged to be the first published version of a work written as early as 1929. The publication figures of works by Stalin are truly enormous. Up to 1949, 11 editions of Problems of Leninism had been 238 times reprinted in 52 languages to a total of 16,980,000 copies. The short history of the CPSU was first published in a series of articles in Pravda and reproduced in a great many other newspapers and periodicals. Incomplete estimates have put the total circulation of papers and periodicals in which it was reprinted as 85 million. In book form, it went through 234 impressions in 11 years, 1938 to the end of 1949, being published in 66 languages with a total of 35,762,000 copies, of which 27,567,300 were in Russian, 6,405, 5,000 in other languages spoken in the Soviet Union, and 1,789,200 in foreign languages. The brochure on the draft constitution of the USSR had by 1949 achieved a total of 58,878,000 copies. The Russian version of Stalin's collected works appeared in an edition of 500,000 copies. Now, what did the Soviet philosophers of the Stalinist period consider to be Stalin's outstanding contribution to philosophy? We shall examine this question firstly in regard to the field of dialectical materialism. It was no easy task to extract anything epoch-making from Stalin's meager literary output, more especially from the small pamphlet on dialectical and historical materialism. The effort was therefore made to discover something important in the very fact that in this work Stalin had accomplished what fate had not spared any of his classical predecessors the time to achieve. Engels was unable to bring his projected dialectics of nature to completion, nor was Lenin able to turn to account the materials gathered together in his philosophical notebooks. To Stalin alone it had been reserved to give the first comprehensive, systematic account of the doctrine of materialist dialectic. It was deemed a highly significant fact that in the above-mentioned work, Stalin deals first of all with the theory of the, quote, Marxist dialectical method, end quote, and only later with that of, quote, Marxist philosophical materialism, end quote, rather than in the reverse order as had been previously customary, as would have been more appropriate to the matter in hand, since, as will be shown later, quote, dialectical materialism means not a method only, but primarily a rhythm of development in reality itself. Further, distinctive services to philosophy on Stalin's part were seen in the fact that in this work he had raised the principle of philosophical partisanship to a higher level, and that, at a time when a variety of idealistic conclusions were being drawn from the striking advances in atomic physics, he had again defended the materiality of the world. In the field of logic, Stalin had once more upheld the knowability of the world against the quote, physical idealism and agnosticism of Weissman-Morganism. He had demonstrated the dialectical character of the process of cognition, and in so doing had preserved dialectical logic against the errors of abandoning precision and concreteness of thought and violating the law of contradiction. So too, after the appearance of the letters on linguistics in Stalin's last work, the Soviet philosophers were again to be found zealously engaged in setting forth the fundamental importance of these writings for the further development of Marxist philosophy. So far as the letters on linguistics were concerned, the going was somewhat easier for them, since the Stalinist notion of a violent upheaval, a quote, explosion, does indeed represent a novelty in the history of dialectical materialism. For till then it had been the leap of transition from one quality to another which was held to be sudden and violent, it being this which constituted the radical difference between the revolutionary and evolutionary phases in the process of development. Now, however, Stalin was teaching that this leap itself may take place not only in the form of a violent upheaval or, quote, explosion, but also, quote, in the form of a gradual transition, end quote. We can see, therefore, that it was no easy task for the Soviet philosophers to be called on to inflate these three small works of Stalin's, helped out by his relatively scattered references to philosophical topics in earlier writings, into something of epoch-making novelty. From what has been said above, the reader will doubtless already be in a position to draw his own conclusions about Stalin's philosophical importance. Stalin was very far from having the degree of philosophical culture that Lenin possessed. Stalin's philosophical training was that required of any high-placed communist, a basic knowledge of dialectical materialism and a certain adroitness in applying it to political and social questions. One may certainly grant him a special mastery of this art. On purely philosophical questions, however, he is less at home. His incursions into this field are therefore often very sketchy, nor does he evince in them any great power of precise expression or really consecutive argument. In one of his earliest works titled Anarchism or Socialism, Stalin attempts, in speaking of the cognitive act, to demonstrate that the external world is prior to human consciousness, and alleges the materialist theory says, quote, that our conceptions, our, quote, self, exist only insofar as external conditions exist that give rise to impressions in our, quote, self, end quote. Here he simply fails to notice how he identifies, quote, ourself with the act of cognition. We find a similar shortcut in his tract on dialectical and historical materialism, the, quote, pinnacle of Marxist-Leninist philosophical thought, end quote, where he is seeking to prove the dependence of ideologies, philosophy, legal and moral opinions, social attitudes, etc., on the economic life of society, by reference to the conditioning of consciousness by the material object in the individual act of cognition. Quote, if nature, being the material world, is primary and mind, thought, is secondary, derivative, if the material world represents objective reality existing independently of the mind of men, while the mind is a reflection of this objective reality, it follows that the material life of society's being is also primary, and society's spiritual life secondary, derivative, and that the material life of society is an objective reality existing independently of the will of men, while the spiritual life of society is a reflection of this objective reality, a reflection of being. End quote. Stalin. From the History of the CPSU Bolsheviks. No, that's from Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which, again, I think is a chapter in... Wasn't that already said that it was a chapter in CPSU B, the short course? Anyway, apart from the fact that in this argument Stalin, like Lenin, assumes without attempting to justify it theoretically, a parallel between the individual consciousness and a social consciousness and, quote, spiritual life, which are quite different from this, Stalin also proceeds without further ado to carry over what is true of the former and apply it to the latter, just as individual awareness is conditioned by the material world existing apart from our awareness, so too with social awareness. Here Stalin slips in the course of his argument into a mistake which goes right back to Marx, in that he supposes social consciousness to be conditioned wholly by social material being, whereas individual consciousness is conditioned by material being simpliciter. What the argument is supposed to prove is the Marxian thesis that different economic and social arrangements go together with different ideologies, and that the inherently vicious social being of the capitalist order of society is also accompanied by symptoms of vice in its social consciousness, its ideologies, which can only be removed by the restoration of health to the being of society after the socialist revolution. Even if it be assumed that there is a social consciousness in addition to that of the individual, and that the same laws apply to both, this argument from the parallel between them would only hold water if individual consciousness were conditioned, not by material being as such, but by the actual material being of the knowing individual himself, or in more concrete terms, not by the material external world, but by the degree of maturity and state of health of the knowing individual. These examples may suffice to indicate the sort of philosophical level on which Stalin's arguments operate, and what becomes of his often wondrously, quote, convincing demonstrations when they are subjected to genuine philosophical criticism. If Stalin's, quote, epoch-making significance, and, quote, in the field of dialectical materialism crumbles on closer inspection into nothing, the same can hardly be said of his importance in the sphere of historical materialism, where he is much more in his element. Here, too, the Soviet philosopher's first concern was to discover in anything and everything some further significant achievement on Stalin's part. Marx and Engels had worked out the laws of the origin, growth, and decline of capitalist society. Lenin had discovered the principles governing imperialism and also those of socialist revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Stalin was now credited with having disclosed the law of development of socialism after its victory in the USSR, and with having established the road to communism. By way of preliminary to the attainment of socialism, he had first of all begun by laying down a strictly scientific, practical, and theoretical program of socialist industrialization. Secondly, Stalin was responsible for having worked out in theory and implemented in practice the plan for the collectivization of agriculture. He was also held to have improved upon Leninism in regard to a number of problems, such as those of the state, social classes, labor, the driving forces of social development, and the position of nationalities under socialism and communism. On the subject of the state, Stalin had shown that although Engels' formula about its, quote, withering away, end quote, is correct in principle, it presupposes the victory of socialism throughout the whole world. So long as, quote, capitalist encirclement, end quote, continues, the machinery of government must also be retained, but it is nevertheless possible under these circumstances to achieve communism in one country alone. In the theory of social classes, Stalin had been the first to give an account of the social structure under socialism in the USSR. The establishment of socialism in the USSR implies the complete destruction of all the exploiting classes, the last of them being that of the kulaks on the land. Socialist society in the Soviet Union now consists of two classes only, though there is no antagonism between them, and their nature has undergone a radical transformation. The workers and the peasantry. The Soviet intelligentsia no longer represents a class on its own. Only in days to come under communism, when the antithesis between town and country and between mental and physical labor have at last been overcome, will class distinctions be entirely done away with. There are, however, 3 points in particular to be emphasized, wherein Stalin did indeed show some originality in his conception of historical materialism, and in which, though following to some extent in Lenin's footsteps, he does make considerable departures from the original Marxian view. They are A, the exceptional significance he attaches to the retroactive influence of the superstructure, i.e. the intellectual factor of consciousness, on the basis in the course of historical development. B, the solution of two individual problems concerning the developmental laws of the socialist classless society, that of its, quote, driving forces, and that of the, quote, leaps in the development of a socialist society. C. The ever-increasing importance it comes to assign to the national factor. As regards the retroactive influence of the superstructure on the economic base, Stalin's underlining of, quote, the tremendous organizing, mobilizing, and transforming value of new ideas, new theories, new political views, and new political institutions, end quote. Stalin. And no more than a renewal of Stalin's campaign, is no more than a renewal of Lenin's campaign on behalf of consciousness against the economists who derived the whole process of historical development from the economic factor alone. Marxism may indeed have traced the origin of these ideas and institutions to the conditions of material life in a given society, but it by no means follows from this that these ideas, once arisen, cannot react in turn upon the material basis, social being, and contribute powerfully to its further development. Quote, new social ideas and theories arise only after the development of the material life of society has set new tasks before society. But once they have arisen, they become a most potent force which facilitates the carrying out of the new tasks set by the development of the material life of society, a force which facilitates the progress of society, ... New social ideas and theories arise precisely because they are necessary to society, because it is impossible to carry out the urgent tasks of development of the material life of society without their organizing, mobilizing, and transforming action, ... Thus, social ideas, theories, and political institutions, having arisen on the basis of the urgent tasks of the development of the material life of society, the development of social being, themselves then react upon social being, upon the material life of society, ... End quote. Stalin. Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Stalin subsequently dwelt on this point once more in the first of his letters on linguistics. This is bound up with the fact that the Leninist-Stalinist view of historical materialism also leaves more room again for the role of the individual. In theory, Stalin abides by the Marxian conception of the subordinate part assigned to the individual as a factor in history. Just as in his early work, Anarchism or Socialism, Stalin had found the main difference between anarchism and socialism to be that the one builds upon the individual, the other on the masses. So Stalin insisted in his Dialectical and Historical Materialism that in viewing the historical process, one must rely, quote, on the concrete conditions of the material life of society as the determining force of social development, not on the good wishes of, quote, great men, end quote, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. But this did not alter the fact that, especially after the posthumous dethronement of the one-time leading Soviet historian, Pokrovsky, of whom more will be heard anon, the individual was in fact increasingly reinstated in his old rights. Whereas in the orthodox Marxist picture of history provided by Pokrovsky, the focus of interest lay in demonstrating the efficacy of Marx's, quote, iron laws in history, and the individual was regarded only as an exponent of the economic factors setting history in motion. The patriotism which spread throughout the Soviet Union from 1934 onwards also had the effect of redirecting interest upon the great figures in the country's history on their own account. Ivan the Terrible, Tsarist generals such as Kutuzov, and even Alexander Nevsky, who is venerated as a saint by the Russian Church, were resurrected in literature and on the stage and screen. At the same time, this provided an opportunity for turning the Bolshevik leaders themselves, Lenin and Stalin, even while he was still alive, into objects of an open, unconcealed cult. The same tendency to reassign a more significance to the superstructure to the superstructure, i.e. the intellectual factor, can also be seen in Stalin's method of solving the problem of the two laws of development aforementioned, which are supposed to govern the progress of the classless socialist society. Marx had pointed to class contradictions as incentives to social development in that they give rise to class war. But since in the socialist society there are no longer supposed to be any class antagonisms, it was necessary to discover new driving forces of social development. If the attainment of socialist society officially promulgated in the 1936 Constitution was not to bring the course of history to a stop. Moreover, Marx had also pointed out that historical development is dialectical in character, in that at certain nodal points the social contradictions are resolved in revolution, The continuous evolution hitherto prevailing is replaced by a dialectical leap, a radical break in social development. But now, even according to Marx, the proletarian revolution is supposed to be the last concluding stage of the process. Hence, therefore, the problem which, though less pressing for Marx himself, required to be settled by Stalin once the new constitution had been introduced: how can social development continue thereafter to have a dialectical character if there are to be no more revolutions? To take this latter question first, Stalin found the answer in his letters on linguistics by distinguishing different types of dialectical leap. As already mentioned, the leaps are only supposed to take the form of, quote, explosions in an antagonistic class society. In socialist society, they are alleged in the first place to occur much more, quote, gradually. Secondly, and by no means less importantly, they no longer lead to the collapse of the existing regime. Stalin found examples of such novel leaps in social development in the Stakhanov movement, and more particularly in the collectivization of agriculture. Since the latter, however, was not effected without resistance on the part of the peasantry, he coined for this process the euphemistic term, quote, revolution from above, end quote, because, quote, the revolution was accomplished on the initiative of the existing power with the support of the bulk of the peasantry, end quote. Stalin, which is a lie. We are not so much concerned at this point with the cynicism implicit in Stalin's reference to the, quote, support of the bulk of the peasantry, end quote. Stalin is himself obliged to admit in the history of the CPSUB that the peasants resisted collectivization in attempts to palm off responsibility on the party agencies in charge of having pressed the matter too forcibly, though, as he once confided personally to Churchill, 10 million kulaks lost their lives in the process. What is much more important to us here is the concept of a, quote, revolution from above, end quote. For in this instance, the initiative proceeds from the state power, i.e. from the superstructure and from the party, which must also be assigned to the superstructure and in Lenin's view is held to represent the organized consciousness of the working class. We have already referred to Stalin's enumeration of the new driving forces in the development of socialist society: the moral and political unity of Soviet society, friendship among the peoples of the Soviet Union, social patriotism and criticism and self-criticism. We shall return to these principles at greater length in Part 2. Here we merely wish to observe briefly that these factors are also exclusively mental in character. The first three must be ascribed to the field of volition, while criticism and self-criticism belongs to that of the understanding. Nowhere in Stalin's teaching is his departure from the original intention of Marx's historical materialism more evident than it is at this point. Marx would literally turn in his grave if we were to learn of this complete reversal of his materialist conception of history, or to get wind of the fact that in the socialist order of society, social development is primarily determined by wide-ranging moral and spiritual factors, and that motivating forces in history are again to be supplied by that very, quote, criticism which he explicitly attacked in his polemic against Bruno Bauer and co., and their wish to see philosophical, quote, criticism installed as the determining factor in history, at the period when he was striving to establish his own materialist conception of history. This contradiction of the Marxian formulation of historical materialism is supposedly glossed over by saying that the question here is concerned merely with a retroactive effect which emerges as a secondary result of the influence of the economic basis and merely assists the latter to, quote, take shape and consolidate itself, end quote. Stalin. But this is a purely formal solution. The importance assigned by Stalinism to the moral and subjective factor in historical development is altogether too large for it to be reckoned as merely, quote, assisting the process. The closer this process of development approaches to communism, the greater the significance ascribed by Stalinism to the, quote, subjective factor, end quote, i.e. to factors such as consciousness, organization, will, and determination. Indeed, they actually become a, quote, decisive force in history. It is, moreover, of cardinal importance here to observe that there has probably been little or no change in official Soviet doctrine on this point as a result of the, quote, de-Stalinization policy. For in the first place, the whole Stalinist conception of the, quote, organizing, mobilizing, and transforming, end quote, significance of the superstructure is already laid down in principle in Lenin's theory of Zolznatelnost. And besides, all four of the new driving forces that Stalin unearthed to propel the development of socialist society are also found cropping up again in Khrushchev's report to the 20th Party Congress. A still more striking alteration of the Marxian view of history is effected by Stalin in relation to the national question. It was indeed merely a corollary of the reinstatement of the individual, and the enhanced significance allotted to the subjective factor, that the importance of the national issue should also have come increasingly to the fore. But although the rehabilitation of subjective moral and ethical values could be effected with at least a semblance of preserving Marx's materialist conception of history, by speaking of a, quote, reciprocal action, quote, of the superstructure upon the basis, it was no longer easy in the course of a positive treatment of the national factor to remain within the categorical framework of basis and superstructure. Stalin eventually found himself compelled, therefore, in his letters on linguistics, to embark on a thoroughgoing, quote, extension of this framework and construe it in somewhat relative fashion by explaining that not all social phenomena can be reduced to the categories of basis and superstructure. The national question had long been a field in which Stalin was especially interested. His earlier writings on the subject were unambiguously committed to the view that social interests take precedence over national interests. While allowing certain formal concessions, languages, schools, etc., to the different national cultures, he did so only in order that these national cultures might be the more readily imbued with a socialist spirit. A classical example of his views in this connection may be found in his observations to the 16th Party Congress of 1930, at which he coined the celebrated formula that, quote, national cultures must be, quote, national in form but socialist in content, end quote. We shall venture to quote here a fairly lengthy excerpt from the speech in question, the more so as it is somewhat difficult of access for the English-speaking reader, being no longer included in the 11th edition of Problems of Leninism, on which English translation is based. At the same time, this passage is also a good example of the way in which Stalin treats of social problems against a background of dialectical materialist philosophy. Against the quote, deviation towards Great Russian chauvinism, end quote, which had cited Lenin in support of its view that the slogan of national culture was a bourgeois slogan, Stalin defends the right of national minorities to cultural development. Quote, Lenin did indeed qualify the slogan of national culture under the rule of the bourgeoisie as a reactionary slogan. But could it be otherwise? What is national culture under the rule of the national bourgeoisie? It is culture that is bourgeois in content and national in form, having the object of doping the masses with the poison of nationalism and of strengthening the rule of the bourgeoisie. What is national culture under the dictatorship of the proletariat? It is the culture that is socialist in content and national in form, having the object of educating the masses in the spirit of socialism and internationalism. How is it possible to confuse these two fundamentally different things without breaking with Marxism? Is it not obvious that in combating the slogan of national culture under the bourgeois order, Lenin was striking at the bourgeois content of national culture and not at its national form? It would be foolish to suppose that Lenin regarded socialist culture as non-national, as not having a particular national form. Those who are deviating towards Great Russian chauvinism are profoundly mistaken in believing that the period of building socialism in the USSR is the period of the collapse and abolition of national cultures. The very opposite is the case. In point of fact, the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of the building of socialism in the USSR is a period of the flowering of national cultures that are socialist in content and national in form. End quote. Stalin. Here, however, the question arises as to how this proposed flowering of national cultures is to be reconciled with the socialist ideal of a unified socialist culture of the future. In the solution of this problem, Stalin proves himself as nimble in dialectics as he had previously shown himself adept at splitting philosophical hairs in his distinction between the socialist content of a culture and its national form. Quote, it may seem strange that we who stand for the future merging of national cultures into one common, both in form and content culture, with one common language, should at the same time stand for the flowering of national cultures at the present moment, in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But there is nothing strange about it. The national cultures must be allowed to develop and unfold to reveal all their potentialities in order to create the conditions for merging them into one common culture with one common language in the period of the victory of socialism all over the world. The flowering of cultures that are national in form and socialist in content under the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country for the purpose of merging them into one common socialist, both in form and in content culture, with one common language, when the proletariat is victorious all over the world, and when socialism becomes the way of life, it is just this that constitutes the dialectics of the Leninist presentation of the question of national culture. Stalin. At this point, Stalin expressly addresses himself to the problem of Marxist dialectic and defends it against the charge of contradiction, drawing a parallel as he does so between the future coalescence of national cultures and the promised withering away of the state. Quote, "It may be said that such a presentation of the question is, quote, contradictory, but is there not the same, quote, contradictoriness in our presentation of the question of the state? We stand for the withering away of the state. At the same time, we stand for the strengthening of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the mightiest and strongest state power that has ever existed. The highest development of state power with the object of preparing the conditions for the withering away of state power, such as the Marxist formula. Is this, quote, contradictory? Yes, it is, quote, contradictory, but this contradiction is bound up with life and it fully reflects Marx's dialectics, ... Anyone who fails to understand this peculiar feature and, quote, contradiction of our transition period, anyone who fails to understand these dialectics of the historical processes, is dead as far as Marxism is concerned, end quote." Stalin. Although here, in theory at least, the national element is still clearly and decidedly subordinated to the socialist national culture, being valued only as a preparation for the common socialist culture of the future, in which individual national cultures are due to merge and disappear. From 1934 onwards, there was a definite and surprising shift of emphasis on this point in favor of the national factor, and in actual fact predominantly in favor of the Russian national element. Klaus Meinert is very important in illuminating, in Klaus Meinert's very important in illuminating study, Stalin versus Marx, has brought together a massive evidential material throwing light on the details of this changeover. It began quite suddenly with a decree issued on the 16th of May 1934 and signed by Stalin and Molotov concerning the teaching of history, which condemned the whole of Soviet historiography up to that date, and especially its most prominent representative, M.N. Pokrovsky, who died in 1932. Pokrovsky, whose chief work, The History of Russia, had received the highest praise from Lenin, considered it the task of the historian to demonstrate from the example of every individual nation the correctness of Marx's materialist conception of history. What matters are the general laws of Marxism, the particular affairs of individual peoples appearing merely accidental by comparison. At the same time, he has made it his business to show off the Soviet Union in the best possible light, and this is the more effectively accomplished by painting the darkest possible picture of Russia as it had been before. Even so, the full scope of the new conception of history did not become visible right away. Admittedly, certain happenings, such as the rehabilitation of the words, quote, homeland and, quote, patriotism, and the energetic working up of Soviet patriotism, gave an indication of the quarter in which to look for this new historical view. But it was not until the early, but it was not until the early 40s that its main contours began to emerge in full. The Soviet Union was depicted therein as the heart and backbone of human history, in which everything that had ever taken place within the present territories of the Soviet Union is ranked as part of its history, beginning, therefore, not with the year 1917, but the ancient Chaldeans and Assyrians of the second or even third millennium, quote, before our calendar era, end quote. Everything occurring outside this region is reckoned as a more or less marginal phenomenon in world history. It therefore becomes a chief task of the Soviet historian to vindicate the primacy of the Soviet Union in every field of culture, and more especially when dividing history into periods, to give proof that the Russians were ahead of other peoples in the inauguration of each historical epoch. And since the Russian people are the leading nation in the Soviet Union, this patriotism, which had originally taken the form of Soviet patriotism, emerges more and more as an officially inspired Russian national patriotism. Sorry, 1 second. I want to copy that down if I can. Using a different PDF than I was before. The PDF before was terrible. Oh, that seems to be working. Okay. The official ideological background ultimately achieved this full development in Stalin's letters on linguistics during the summer of 1950. What chiefly strikes the eye in these letters is, in the first place, the shift of emphasis from class antagonisms to that which serves to unify the different classes within society. The language of a people is the bond which unifies all members of society, whose functions consist, quote, not in serving one class to the detriment of other classes, end quote, but in serving, quote, the entire society, all the classes of society, end quote. If it is not to, quote, degenerate into, quote, the jargon of some social group, end quote, and create the, quote, threat of the disintegration of society, end quote. But language appears here not merely as the bond unifying any sort of society, but more especially as that which unites all the members of a nation together. National languages, quote, are not class but common languages, common to all members of each nation, end quote. A further characteristic change of emphasis may also be noted from the discontinuity of the social development to its continuity. In dealing with the development of language, Stalin is especially insistent on the continuity of language's evolution, which takes place not by means of leaps or, quote, explosions, but by the gradual emergence of new elements and the dying away of old elements. In this connection, he makes the pregnant observation that even in the case of social development, the element of discontinuity should not be overstressed, for it applies only within a class society, not in the classless Soviet Union, where leaps or evolutions no longer occur. In this way, language becomes a bond of unity, not only between the members of a present-day society or nation, but also between the different generations past and to come. This automatically gives rise, without need of assertion on Stalin's part, to an additional readjustment of the balance in favor of the national element. Though it may seem a trifle exaggerated to go on, as Professor V.V. Mavrodin did in a speech at Leningrad, and affirm on the strength of this new Stalinist, quote, line, that the people is, quote, eternal, the nation, thanks to its greater longevity than the class, does at all events take on a greater degree of importance in comparison with the latter. Whereas class antagonisms are already destined to disappear during the period of realizing socialism in one country, the Soviet Union, the merging, which is still insisted on, of national cultures and languages into a common culture and language is only due to begin after the victory of communism all over the world. The threatened supersession of nationalism is thereby postponed to the Greek kalends. And finally, there is yet a fourth shift of position to be detected in these letters of Stalin's, the dominant status according therein to the Russian language, which has emerged victorious from all previous encounters with other languages. Zaslavsky, indeed, already discerns the dawn of the period in which Russian will become the international world language, as did Latin was the world language of antiquity, French that of feudalism, and English that of imperialism, so we already see Russia emerging as the world language of socialism. Now, what is the deeper significance of all this? The primary reason for it was doubtless the endeavor to provide a Marxist justification for the rehabilitation of the national factor. Klaus Menert considered that Stalin had learnt from Hitler to put a high value on the importance of the national element. Hence, the fact that the inauguration of the nationalist policy in the Soviet Union should have coincided with the seizure of power by National Socialism in Germany. And this is kind of a thing that, like, the German Communist Party, and I'm not an expert on it, but to my understanding, like, basically tried to demonstrate that National Socialists they tried to, like, out-nationalist National Socialism. Anyway, it may be a slight exaggeration, but I don't think quite too much. Hitler's example may indeed have had great influence in accelerating the adoption of the course in question, but too much stress should not be laid, in our opinion, on the novelty of this policy that has prevailed in Russia since 1934. For in the first place, the tendency to make the Soviet Union the be-all and end-all of history is already discernible in Russia a good 10 years before 1934. The transformation of the Comintern into a docile instrument of the Soviet government and the Russian Communist Party was already beginning in Lenin's lifetime. Even when the complaint was heard that Russia was no longer the vanguard of the communist world revolution, but rather that the international communist movement was being turned into the rear guard of the Soviet Union. And so far as the ever-increasing insistence on Russian and patriotism is concerned, it is noteworthy in the extreme that even Lenin himself should have complained of Stalin's pursuit of great Russian nationalism in his attitude towards the Georgian communists, and that a quarrel would have broken out between them on this very point if Lenin's illness had not put a sudden end to any further control on his part of the affairs of the regime. Footnote. This was occasioned by Stalin's recalcitrant attitude towards the constitutional reform of 1922, which transformed what had hitherto been the Russian Soviet Federative Republic into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with equal rights granted to all the participating nations, also by Stalin's brutal measures in the Caucasus, not only against the Georgian Mensheviks who dreamed of a sort of new Switzerland between Europe and Asia, but even against the Georgian Bolsheviks who favored immediate entry into the Union as an independent Soviet republic and not an indirect adherence as part of Stalin's projected Transcaucasian Federation. When Lenin came to hear of the violence practiced in the Caucasus on Stalin's orders by Ordzhonikidze and Dzerzhinsky, can never pronounce that guy's name, Iron Felix, he was highly incensed, accused Stalin and Dzerzhinsky, who were neither of them Russian-born, of, quote, pure Russian nationalism, and remarked that Russified products of other nations were often worse chauvinists than Russians by birth. Lenin ended by giving orders that they should both be called to account for, quote, this great Russian nationalist campaign, end quote. In a note of the 4th of January 1923, Lenin sums up Stalin as follows, quote, Stalin is too rude, and his fault, though entirely supportable in relations amongst communists, becomes insupportable in the office of General Secretary, end quote, Lenin, and goes on to consider whether the dangers of a split owing to differences of opinion between Stalin and Trotsky might be obviated by putting in someone else instead of Stalin as General Secretary of the party. After Lenin had got wind of renewed acts of violence by Stalin in Georgia, Lenin's secretary reported on the 6th of March 1923, quote, Vladimir Ilyich is preparing a bomb for Stalin at the Congress, end quote. And his widow Krupskaya tells us of the last letter that Lenin was able to dictate, quote, Vladimir has just dictated to the stenographer a letter to Stalin, breaking off all relations with him, end quote. On this subject, see Boris Suvorin, Stalin, A Critical Survey of Bolshevism. End footnote. In addition to this, the significance of the letters on linguistics has often been seen in the fact that they transform linguistics into a, quote, instrument of Russian imperialism, end quote. It is true enough that in this work Stalin not only sought to effect a theoretical rehabilitation of the national factor, but also endeavored to harness Russian nationalism to his car, and therefore gave the Russian people the leading role among the nationalities of the Soviet Union. But an appeal was also intended to the national feelings of other peoples, inasmuch as they are assured the fullest development of their national cultures under the leadership of the Russian people, and insofar as the, quote, friendship of the peoples of the Soviet Union, end quote, is designated as an incentive to the development of socialist society. Besides this, it also appears, as N. Gradoboyev has pointed out, that Stalin appeals to national feelings was directed above all to the colonial peoples. He obviously hoped that the establishment of communism on a world scale would be more readily attained by mobilizing the national struggles for liberation of the colonial and oppressed peoples than by stoking the embers of class war. Stalin would therefore seem to have been concerned here with the cultivation of a Soviet rather than a Russian brand of imperialism. No less significant, however, than the stress laid on the national factor is the pronounced conservative tendency which runs through Stalin's letters on linguistics and is evinced in all the shifts of emphasis already referred to. The function of language is to serve as a unifying bond for the whole of society, in order to prevent society from falling to pieces. After a much earlier talk of the class struggle, one cannot but be struck by this insistence on a unifying bond for the whole of society. In the theory of the various types of dialectical leap and of the quote, revolution from below, and quote, the conservative impulse is plainly visible. The poison fangs must be drawn from the dialectic, lest its leaps should one day operate also to the disadvantage of the communist power machine. The rehabilitation of the national factor again sounds an unmistakably conservative note. A similar conservative tendency and a corresponding retreat from a too unguarded extension of Marxist doctrines is likewise observable in Stalin's last work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. It was Stalin himself who in earlier years had put forward the theory of the retroactive influence of the superstructure on the basis, and had dwelt on the quote, tremendous organizing, mobilizing, and transforming value of new ideas, new political institutions, end quote, i.e., above all, the institutions of the Communist Party and the Soviet state. But in so doing, he had inspired certain hotheads with the idea that the party could do anything. And the great clamor raised about the Miturin-Lysenko theory of inheritance was bound to encourage a similarly misguided view. Indeed, it was precisely for this reason that the theory had found such high favor with the party authorities, since it appeared to offer men the power to dominate nature in the most complete fashion, and themselves to control the development of organic life at their own behest, without being bound in this endeavor by limits due to the immutability of species. Stalin was now obliged to stress that the power of the party was not unlimited, and that it was confronted not only by laws of nature as an objective datum, but even by the laws of social development as well. In this connection, Bertram D. Wolfe makes interesting reference to the note of pessimism which sounds through these essays of Stalin's. It is not just that he credits man only with the power of discovering and making use of natural laws, without being able to suspend them or to create new ones. In the foreground of Stalin's interest in nature, there now stands above all the concern to cope with the quote, destructive action of some of the laws, end quote, to limit their field of operation, to take precautions against natural disasters, floods, and inundations. We observe here that Stalin's conservative tendency emerges inter alia from the letters on linguistics, in his view of language as a bond unifying the whole of society. In his last work, he goes still further in this respect and uncovers many other more deep-lying bonds uniting society in all ages and among all nations. Against Yaroshenko, who had denied the need for a single political economy applicable to all levels of social development, Stalin points out that there are also laws of social development common to all social formations, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism alike, such as e.g. the, quote, law of the unity of productive forces and the relations of production, end quote. And it concludes from this, quote, hence social formations are not only divided from one another by their own specific laws, but also connected with one another by the economic laws common to all formations, end quote. Stalin. In replying here to Yaroshenko, Stalin speaks only of a, quote, law of the unity of productive forces and the relations of production. But at the outset of Stalin's essay, he refers to it as the, quote, law of the relations of production. The, quote, law that the relations of production must necessarily conform with the character of productive forces, end quote, Stalin. Whereas in Marx's introduction to the critique of political economy, this law is purely descriptive in character, it is here transformed under Stalin's hand, as H. Chamb has pertinently observed, into a, quote, normative law or a postulate. This carries on the conservative trend which in both Stalin's previous writings was implicit in the theory of the active role of the superstructure, meaning by this in particular the Communist Party and the Soviet government, just as this latter theory was already able to justify in the Soviet Union the prior erection of the political structure of socialism, the Soviet state, before the creation of the socialist economic basis. So now the law of the, quote, necessary conformity of productive forces and relations of production also made it possible to justify the undisguised and extremely vigorous intervention of the state when, immediately after the revolution, and particularly during the collectivization of agriculture, the new relations of production were imposed by force. In so doing, it was merely proceeding in accordance with its knowledge of objective economic law. As in the case of the objective character of social laws of development, so Stalin also beats a similar retreat with regard to the elimination of the distinctions between town and country and mental and physical labor. Hitherto, the impression had been given that in the Marxist utopia, the classless society of the future, the antitheses between town and country, industry and agriculture, mental and physical labor would be completely done away with. It was supposed not only that labor in general would be transformed from a burden into a primary necessity of life, but that in consequence of the use of technology, more or less the same working conditions would prevail everywhere, and moreover that owing to the high cultural level of mankind, everyone would be capable of performing any kind of work. On this point also, Stalin found himself obliged to damp down the expectations placed upon the ideal communist society of the future. The promised elimination of the distinctions between town and country and mental and physical labor signifies merely the removal of the opposition, which is an essential feature of capitalism and consists in a conflict of interest, and likewise the removal of the essential distinction, which still holds good even in the socialist society. Holds good even in the socialist society. So far as the antithesis of town and country is concerned, this consisted under capitalism in the exploitation of the country by the town, in the, quote, ruin of the majority of the rural population by the whole course of development of industry, trade, and credit under capitalism, end quote. Stalin. The antithesis between mental and physical labor, between physical workers and the managerial personnel in industry, has similarly been based on exploitation of the physical workers by the representatives of mental labor. In the Socialist Society of the Soviet Union, according to Stalin, the basis of the opposition between town and country has at length been removed by the liquidation of the property owners and the alliance between workers and peasants, who are now supposed to share the same interest. The same is also held to be true of the antithesis between mental and physical labor. For all that, an essential distinction between town and country still remains, for the time being, even in Soviet society. It consists in this: that public ownership of the means of production prevails generally in industry, whereas group ownership, the kolkhoz, still continues to be the rule in agriculture. Not till this group ownership has been converted into public ownership will the essential distinction between town and country also disappear. The same applies to the distinction between mental and physical work. It will only be removed when the physical workers have attained the cultural and technical level of the technicians. But this will serve only to remove the essential distinctions involved, and not every sort of distinction. Some such contrast will always remain, if only because of the difference in working conditions between industrial and agricultural labor, and likewise mental and physical labor. And Stalin stresses that, quote, some distinction, even if inessential, end quote, will always remain, even in the future, and this, quote, because of the conditions of labor of the managerial staffs and those of the workers are not identical, end quote. Finally, Stalin is not only concerned to tone down the expectations reposed in the communist ideal society, but also to put off the redemption date of the innumerable promises secured upon it to the remotest possible future. Having laid down against Yaroshenko the three basic conditions for the transition to communism: continuous expansion of all social production, with a relatively higher rate of expansion of the production of means of production, raising of the collective farm property in the level of public property, advance is the cultural standard of the members of society. He follows this up with the inevitably cautious and non-committal remark that, quote, these are the basic conditions required to pave the way for the transition to communism, end quote. Stalin. Furthermore, in order to realize these, quote, basic conditions, Stalin also goes on in this work to list a number of preconditions, e.g. for raising the level of culture, the working day to be reduced, first to 6 and later to 5 hours, universal compulsory polytechnical education to be introduced, which itself will require a series of preparatory phases, housing conditions to be radically improved, and finally the real wages of workers and employees to be at least doubled, quote, if not more, end quote. Only when all this has been achieved will the, quote, basic conditions, end quote, have been realized. Even then there will always be the possibility, if need be, of interpolating further subsidiary conditions. And supposing these also to be established, we are still no further forward than the possibility of being able to begin, quote, preparations for the transition to communism. Stalin could take his departure with confidence. The danger of any premature fulfillment of communist promises had been banished for his successors to be an immeasurably remote future. He had left them in this work a veritable, quote, testament, in which the main features of the Stalinist era of communism are again highlighted and also supposedly fixed for the future. The progressive increase in the production of capital goods is to ensure that in the future also the populace will be subjected to an extreme privation of consumer goods. The, quote, raising of collective farm property to the, quote, level of public property will serve to complete the disinheritance of the peasantry by depriving the peasantry of all the last semblance of roots in the ownership of land. The announcement that even days to come, the, quote, conditions of labor of the managerial staffs and those of the workers will not be, quote, identical, is intended to sanction once and for all the privileged status of the main props of the Stalinist regime, namely the, quote, technical personnel, end quote, and to gild and render it palatable by appealing to the developmental laws of socialism. And that's the end of chapter 10 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a historical and systematic survey? Yes, a historical and systematic survey. Thank you so much for listening.